I should tell our panelists, I can see a steady rise in the number of attendees who continue to trickle in. So we're going to give them a moment until everyone has had a chance to join us. This is a really interesting experience for me. No one has ever asked me to have a conversation or to moderate a conversation on a topic like death and grief before. It's a unique challenge. And it was only after I started having conversations with the other panelists, I realized how much there is to talk about and why we should be having these conversations more often. So I'm really happy about the panel that has been put together by Pallium India. I welcome all of our panelists and our audience members to this conversation. We're going to try and also take questions from the audience, which you can leave in the chat window. You can also put it in the Facebook comment section if you're watching this on Facebook. And someone from the team will pull those out and we'll try and address as many of those questions as we can. Thank you for joining us. It means a great deal to us that you've taken time out as audience members to be part of this conversation. Let me do a quick round of introductions of the members of our panel, who are a fantastic group of people, very patient and generous with their time. So it's really nice to have them. Dr. Rajni Bhatt is a pulmonologist and she's with the governing council. She's a governing council member of the Indian Association of Bronchology. Insia Dariwala is an award-winning international filmmaker, a TEDx speaker, and a campaigner of social issues. So she's a really interesting voice. She has a very interesting perspective on the matter. Dr. Roop Gurushahani is a consulting neurologist, and he was also a committee member. He's also a steering committee member in the End of Life Care India Task Force. Smriti Rana, Director of Programs at Pallium India, will bring in this whole point of what it's like right now to be a counselor for caregivers. So she's currently, and through the course of this lockdown, been actually talking to doctors and nurses, people who are doing the real work really in battling COVID, and talking to them about their own coping mechanisms and what it's been like to experience this much loss over the last few months. Harsh Sahani is a public health consultant who also joins us through this conversation as we talk about basically bringing all of this knowledge and experience in to mainstream and figuring out why we don't have enough structures in place to help our healthcare professionals deal with grief and to deal with families that are going through grief. Again, a good evening to everyone and thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure for me to be part of this panel and we will try and work in as many views as possible. To my panel, please feel free to chime in and respond to each other. This is what makes it lively. It'll be really nice to hear your points of view on all of the things that have been said on this panel as well. Let me start with Insia. Insia, good evening. And I know that this being part of this panel was a big decision for you because you have some personal experiences and your professional experiences right now that make you uniquely qualified to give us a perspective on why this is important. And if you are comfortable sharing some of those experiences with us about experiences of dealing with death and what it's like to be a caregiver and why somehow within our system in India where it's a very harsh system. I've personally experienced grief as well, because you get shoved through hospital, postmortem, doctor, municipal corporation, something else, and it's an impersonal wave that hits you, and you only get a moment to catch your breath about a week after. Do you believe that there's a sensitivity lacking in our system right now?
First of all, thank you, Faye. Thank you for introducing me to the audience, and I would like to thank Pallium for getting me on this panel. It's something that I think is very important, being that we are living in the times that we are living. And like you said, we never talk about these issues. So they're very difficult conversations to have. In fact, I have been nervous since morning, wondering, how do I go about with this? What if I get vulnerable? And I would just like to give a trigger warning out there that, in case I do tear up, to not get triggered, or get triggered if you have to, because it's okay to be vulnerable. So if I start from my own personal experience within my family. So The story is the backstory rather of my grief is the fact that just when the lockdown had started, my aunt, maternal aunt, was diagnosed with lung cancer, and her she was very rapidly declining in health. And at that time, COVID struck. There was a lockdown everywhere, all over the world. My aunt is in, or rather was in New York. You see how I am still having difficulty in even referring to her in the past tense. That's just because I haven't got closure on it yet. So my aunt was in New York. My mom, she too lives very close to her. And at that time, the last time that I spoke to her was on March 12th, and she had just come home from a chemo, and she was very excited and thinking that she's going to become well very soon. In 1 month, everything changed. April 12th, which was Easter, my family celebrates, maternal side is they are practicing Catholics, and we were celebrating, or rather wanted to celebrate Easter with her, and that was the day when she passed away. So I don't even know how to, express what I went through, because here, it was just a month. I mean, I was still getting used to the fact that she was diagnosed with cancer. And then suddenly to just all of the entire story to have just ended in that 1 month, where we got to know that while she was going to get her chemo, she also got infected with the COVID-19 virus. And that's what caused a rapid decline in her health. And so when we got to hear that news, it was devastating, because here I am in India, in Bombay, my mom and my aunt in New York, my cousins, whose mother passed away in LA and in Florida. Nobody was together. Grief had suddenly gone online. It was virtual, and we had to just deal with it in the best way we could. And I remember a very, very, this is a very strong memory in me, is that we were all online, bawling and crying so badly, because we just couldn't, get used to the fact that she had gone so soon. We could not see her, we could not talk to her, nobody could be by her side. We were told that she went peacefully, but nobody knows. Um, so I don't know. I still don't know how to process that, and I think it's been just 2 months ago that my aunt, or rather my mother and my cousins, went into the house and wrapped up everything. And that was very, very, very difficult. I remember hugging the laptop on that day because I saw a house. So I'm sorry. So this is what I was afraid of. And yeah, so that was a very, very difficult time for the family. It's also very difficult to still believe that she's gone, because I just spent 2 weeks with her just before Christmas, and she was hale and hearty. And in fact, she was my pillar of strength, because my mother was in the ICU at that time. And so it just is still something that I'm not put to rest. And and that's why I can relate to when people who are struggling out there, who are dealing with grief, cannot get over it. We are never going to get past this kind of grief, because you're so used. There is a reason why people mourn collectively. There is a reason why funerals happen. We got our aunts, my cousins got their mother's ashes by courier. That, I don't think anybody can get over that. I'm sorry. I know
Do you want to take a moment and we come back to you?
No, that's okay, Faye. I think it's important to cry. I know I'm live. I have like 1,000 people watching me cry right now, and but I'm okay with that. I think it's high time we go past these judgments. And I'm an activist. People consider me very, very strong, but I think it's high time they know that I'm human too. and I do cry, and I am vulnerable. So, so that kind of, for me in these times during the lockdown, it sealed the deal on how grief had just changed for all of us. And while I was dealing with my aunt's grief, dealing with how to adjust to it, got to know that my mom had tested positive for COVID. And so that just threw me completely off, because it was like, god forbid, if something were to happen to her, I couldn't even go to her. And I remember something that my mom did. She had not told us that she had tested positive, but we got to know because there were symptoms that she was showing. So when I spoke to her online, every day we had a video call, and she was dealing with her pain. I mean, she had just lost a sister after 67 years of being together. They had never ever been separated in those 67 years. So she was dealing with that grief and then her health. And I remember her picking up a bag and telling me that, God forbid if something happens to me, this bag has everything in it. And this is what you need to look for. And I don't know how to, even express what I felt at that time. And when we talk about compounded grief, this is what I think it is. Death on one hand, grief of a live one, a living person on the other hand, and then more death. So in my family, I had another death where my cousin lost a husband. I couldn't go for the funeral, even though it is just an hour and a half away from me. But it was just so bad at that time that nobody was allowed. I lost, or rather, my bestie lost her mother while she was talking to me on the phone. I don't know. I don't know how many more people, I was ready to lose. So, right from the news of my aunt passing away to my mother getting COVID, she's, by the way, extremely, healthy today, and I thank God for that. But my cousin's husband passing away, then from the industry, people dying in the industry, Irfan Khan passing away was a very big blow. I had the good fortune, I think, of spending some time with him on my first film together with him. And just couldn't get over that. And then dealing with that, and then Rishi Kapoor passes away. And then the biggest shocker of having Sushant Singh Rajput commit suicide. I remember very clearly, I had bawled. I just ran out of my room bawling and crying. And I don't even know this person. I didn't know him, but I just couldn't take any more death. I couldn't. And I still am hoping and praying. And then today, just 2 days ago, Nishikant Kamath died. So, faith, I don't know. I'm laughing right now, but I think, like I told you the other day, there is a certain numbing that is happening, and I'm scared. I'm scared about it. So, I I don't know how to deal with it today, and I think it's so important that we speak about it. We really need to talk about grief more. We need to talk about death. People don't talk about death, but just because we don't talk about it, it doesn't mean that we are not going to die. We are all going to die someday, and it's not going to stay away. We stay away from death and the news of it, but death is not going to stay away from us. So.
Well, Sia, first of all, thank you for sharing your story. I think that this is, it's so important for one brave person to talk about what they're feeling, to not be afraid of breaking down, to not be afraid of the tears, to not be afraid of the vulnerability, and to share that story. You've said such important things. Dealing with loss at a time when we weren't able to physically be present for each other. We weren't able to actually, I mean, at the end of the day, just see family members, hug someone, have someone sit with you when you're going through what you're going through, to not have all of that, and how crippling all of that can be. That actually sets the tone for what we are talking about. And I am so grateful. And I can see a lot of messages coming from the people who are watching this right now across Facebook and, across the webinar, who are sending you hugs and love and prayer and, and strength and condolences at this point. So we're all with you. And again, I thank you for sharing that story. I want to take this, at this point, to Harsh. Harsh is a new entrant to palliative care, but has been looking at our healthcare systems as an outsider for a while. And, is bringing in right now this perspective, this sort of outsider's view on death and grief and how we're dealing with death and grief within our healthcare systems. And why also, Harsh, we don't have, we don't have an acknowledgement of what it does to family members, of what it does to patients, of what it does to doctors and nurses as well. Your point of view as an outsider and your perspective on the healthcare sector.
Thank you so much, Faye, and thank you so much, NCR. I think you really set the stage for how we have to react to this as humans. And these are abnormal circumstances. We don't know how to cope with grief. But the point is that the systems, the processes are not strong enough to talk about and deal with death and grief in normal circumstances. Insia, you reminded me that dear friend's husband's grandmother, she died last week. And my friend texted me, it's bizarre to think there is no physical trace of someone in this world who was here till yesterday. Nani was old, she had cancer, they had been shuffling hospitals under the cloud of this pandemic, getting Nani the best possible treatment in 2 major metropolitan cities. My friends and the family, they were explained and they understood the newest and highly sophisticated forms of surgery, but no one talked to them about death and grief. The family is now using their own coping mechanisms to process this loss with no institutional or systemic support. I'm so sure, like Insia, like you must have triggered a lot of personal experiences that many of us have gone through. And we can all think of examples in our family or loved ones where death has caught us unawares. And why is this shocking? You know, mortality is as old as humankind. The number of people who will die will be equal to the number of people who inhabit this earth. And while advances in medicine and technology have increased our longevity, they haven't overcome death. And this elixir of life remains confined to mythology and fantasy novels. But yeah, we can use the data from last few million years to conclude that we need to acknowledge death and we need to prepare for it. And we stand here and we just fear death. What does fear lead to? Fear leads to irrational decisions. If we move past fear, if we confront it, we acknowledge it, we start the conversation, that will allow us to plan, that will allow us to finish unfinished business, that will allow us to spend our time wisely. It will also allow us to have a say in how we go. COVID-19, it has already claimed 800,000, over 8 lakh lives, over 50,000 in India alone. And what does that tell us? This blip in nature is actually a catastrophe for humankind. And more than a reminder about the unpredictability but certainty of death, it's a wake-up call to talk about death and grief. Faye, asked me to talk about health systems. I like to borrow from Dr. Atul Gawande. I can't recommend his book on mortality enough, or sorry, it's called Being Mortal enough. And he extensively talks about this advancement of technology and longevity and how it's actually a disacknowledgement of mortality. In his iconic article he had written called Overkill in the New Yorker 5 years ago, he elaborated on the changing nature of healthcare industry. And I said healthcare industry, not healthcare service. He talked about how the article was called Overkill. And to crudely paraphrase, it showed us how advances in medicine and technology have led us to over-test, over-diagnose, over-treat, and that just leads to an overkill. The bottom line was that millions of Americans get tests, drugs, operations that will not make them better. They may even cause harm, and they'll cost billions. But where we stand, we can't rage against the commercialization of healthcare. That will continue to argue and push for longevity even at the cost of quality of life. But what we can do is we can inform ourselves. We can advocate for and practice appropriate care that's with the laws of nature, not against them. That said, measures to cope with death and grief are not unknown. It's up to individuals, it's up to health systems and governments to implement them. In fact, universal health coverage mandates preventive, promotive, curative, rehabilitative, and palliative care. However, rather than this pentagon, we mostly hear about the duality of prevention and cure. what happens when medical remedies and technology reach their logical limits? Every death affects whole communities, and it's just as important to offer appropriate end-of-life care for these communities and the person who's dying to get closure. Coming to your outsider bit, yeah, I'm not a new entrant to public health. I am a new entrant to palliative care. And the first thing I learned is that palliative care is not end-of-life care. End-of-life care is part of palliative care. So palliative care addresses all serious health-related suffering. This includes, but it's not restricted to, tools, techniques, and medicines essential for end-of-life care. And the two things, Faye, coming from outside that really stayed with me about this, arm of the Pentagon was that palliative care addresses the patient and loved ones, not just the disease. So they're not just disease, like if someone has renal failure, so it's not just the kidneys that the treatment is addressing. They are getting into the person's physical needs, their emotional needs, their spiritual needs, and all of this forms part of the plan of care. And another big takeaway from me was the principle of shared decision making, that honest but sensitive and comforting counseling, it forms the bedrock of such decision making. And what's this honesty about? Like when it comes to it, you have to acknowledge death and grief because all of that becomes essential for the care plan. And it's more your obligation to the patient so that they can formulate their advanced healthcare directives. The patient can choose to take a decision like get on a ventilator, or they can choose to accept the inevitable, get on pain relief, surround themselves with family and loved ones, spiritual mentors. Either way, the point was that medicine is not something that's done to the patient, it's something that is done with the patient and the family. I'll just finish with what palliative care I think could do better for health systems. This honest and comforting and defined communication, it strengthens health system. And maybe the example I can use is, I think all of us have doctors whom we trust over and above, maybe even more qualified ones. And why? My educated guess is that it's this compassionate communication that plays a part. And such communication not only forges bonds between the patient and provider, but if practiced widely, even between the health system and communities. And that's really essential. We are seeing this trust waning right now. It's really essential to bridge this gap for the current and future pandemic. Where we stand, death is looming large in front of us, and building taboos around medical realities, be it tuberculosis, cancer, or HIV, they've only harmed the patient and society. It's a great time to acknowledge death and talk about death and grief.
Thanks, Harsh, for that. I'm going to start talking a little faster because we're running out of time now. We're already at 5:23. Dr. Bhatt is with us. I saw a lot of nods from the whole panel when Harsh mentioned shared decision-making and sensitive communication among doctors. And I know, pulmonologists perhaps have been who've had the hardest time over the last 4 months because specifically COVID has been a disease that affects the lungs, and it's, you and the rest of your colleagues have been under a lot of pressure. If you would explain to us, please, what shared decision-making would be in your mind and what your experience has been as a medical professional dealing with grief and death and grieving family members over the last 4 months.
I'd like to start by saying thank you so much, Insia and Harsh, for sharing from the heart. You brought so much already into the discussion on a personal level as well as on a systemic level about all the issues that we need to address in this conversation about death and grief. You saw us nodding furiously, Faye, about shared decision making because communication is really, it has to be a two-way street. It's, one of the biggest, they say that the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. So if as a doctor I have spoken about something with a patient, but I haven't given them the space, the safe space to absorb that information, process it, and tell me what their wishes are, that's not shared decision making. And we must also keep in mind that there's an extension to shared decision making, which is supported decision making. There are members of our society who are more vulnerable, and these might be people with certain disabilities, maybe they might be mental or learning disabilities, they still have decision-making rights over healthcare for their own selves. And sometimes it's just about giving them that little bit of support in my conversation with them that can lead to supported and shared decision-making. So I would like to expand that to shared and supported decision-making, which is far more inclusive. And it kind of goes against the paternalistic, conservative view of medicine which we came from, and is now what we practice is really a patient-centered collaborative process of medicine. And you're so right. I think when I my conversations with my colleagues, the pulmonologists across the country who have been facing the brunt of the pandemic on so many levels, we've all been talking a lot more about our personal experiences with death, grief, helplessness, frustration, a loss of sense of I'm not able to do enough for my community. And I'm just like anybody else who trained in India. We entered med school when straight out of 12th standard. What was our experience with death, dying, sickness, grief? Almost nothing. And most of us had not experienced anything personally. And unfortunately, at a certain time, there wasn't any didactic training or experienced experts to guide us in how to navigate the amount of death and dying and sickness and grieving that we saw. Our families too, traditionally, have not been open about speaking about death and dying. So it's been an evolution for me in my journey as a student, going on to training and fellowship. I was fortunate that I was in a program which spoke about counseling for death, grief, and bereavement. But even so, it's not quite the same thing when you get into practice. If you've not really learned how to cope with the death and grief that patients go through, that we go through as doctors, even taking care of our family members, we learn maladaptive coping mechanisms. We either suppress our emotions, we bury them deep and become hyper efficient. I have to be a good doctor, I must do this, or we compartmentalizing it, hoping to process it later, but maybe we don't come around to it. And what we're witnessing today is that entire burden becoming too much for all of us. And there have been lessons that I have learned along the way. What happens if you do not learn how to cope in a healthy manner with the death and dying and grief that you're witnessing is burnout. And unfortunately for me, I experienced that firsthand. Again, I was fortunate, supportive boss, mentor, colleagues, family, most importantly, the patients, who give you so much of love and attention and faith that they place in you that you find your way back. But I think it's extremely important that we build systems to support healthcare workers in processing death and grief and not thinking of death as personal failure.
Yes, Dr. Bhatt, obviously there are different aspects to the loss when you are a doctor or you're a nurse. The fact that, like you just said, that it's not a professional failure, that a lot of times people feel the need to be detached in order for simply to be able to do their jobs and simply to be able to see the patient as a patient and not be, sort of emotionally led by decision making at that point. Would you explain to us how you see all of that? Do you see the detachment as important? Do you see that the repeated loss or the excessive loss being faced over the last 4 months has resulted also, like Insia said, to a kind of numbing of emotions?
So I think in the past, for when the field of medicine that I've chosen, intensive care and interventional pulmonology, is fraught with day-to-day life and death, moments where there's got to be decisive decision making, putting emotions aside. That's something we're trained to do to a certain extent. And if you have healthy adaptive coping mechanism and systems which allow us to express after an intense episode, if the team debriefs and says what we went through, and these are not something which requires a large process or a meeting, but even 5 minutes where we acknowledge what we went through along with the patient's family or just ourselves as a team, it allows us to express our humanity as people taking care of life and death situations. Now, detachment, I think, is a desirable quality, but that's not quite the same thing as apathy. Detachment means that I can separate my emotions from the actions I need to perform at that time, but it doesn't mean I don't feel any emotions. I might feel the intensity, but I am able to control it at that time to act as is needed for the patient. But if I suppress that emotion completely, if I never express that I felt sorrow, I felt loss, if I was not able to revive my patient, then that will slowly become this numbing, one death, another death, another death. If I don't give room for my emotions,
Mm.
then that's when it becomes numbing. That's when it becomes compassion fatigue. That's when it becomes apathy. That's when you start doing your job mechanically, and that leads to burnout. And burnout is problematic because that is actually going to impact patients and their families negatively, as well as the doctors.
So we have a message right now, and I want to read this out from Kamna Kakkar, who says, I'm an anesthetist, and my last COVID ICU duty, I lost 7 patients in 7 days on my shift. I'm trained to handle death, but not so many all at once.
It's so true, Dr. Kamna. I mean, I mean, my heart goes out to you. Losing 7 patients in 7 days on your shift is heartbreaking for all of you on that team. And I think one of the big lessons that we need to take from, from the pandemic is that we haven't done enough to help our healthcare workers to cope with loss. There was no system in place. You find them in small bits and pieces and small oases where we look out for the mental health of healthcare workers when they go through loss. But we haven't had that systemically. And now you have an overwhelming surge of death and loss. We haven't built the emotional and mental health reserve. That's something we definitely need to address. And believe me, young doctors like Dr. Kamna Kakkar give me hope that unlike our generation, they are more willing to accept and acknowledge their vulnerability. They do not think of death as their failure. They think of expressing their emotions as a way of being stronger doctors. So we can take a page out of their book, I think.
Really well said. As I take the conversation to Dr. Gursahani, I just want to read out another message from Dr. Kamna that's come in. She says, I had to pacify a junior doctor who believed that whichever patient she put a central line into, that patient died. So she had stopped putting in central lines completely. I can see Dr. Roop is smiling. This is, you obviously, this is while COVID is packing in the deaths very, closely, especially in ICUs where the worst happens, you don't seem surprised by this reaction.
No. You want me to speak? But anyway, I mean, I'll leave Rajni to handle this side of the conversation. But I quite understand where Dr. Kakkar and that junior doctor are coming from. Somewhere you end up processing these issues in terms of luck and so many other things. We all become irrational, and you can understand that. So Rajni, I think that's something that you were discussing.
Yeah, Dr. Rashi, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is, one of the things that I'm going to say that Dr. Kamna, I wish that I had faced troubles earlier in my career, because these are not failures. Procedures have complications associated with them, and if you do them often enough, you will face them. None of us is infallible. And sometimes it's always better to learn how to accept these while we are in training. Otherwise, you face what I did, which is burnout as a consultant. But I think it's important that our systems teach the next generation of healthcare workers how to understand and accept and learn from these. It isn't about luck. It isn't about anyone. Medicine has superstitions around it. Heavy-footed people bringing in a lot of patients on an ER shift. All of that's there. You never say it's a light shift, because then it becomes a heavy shift. We're all like that. But we have to learn to accept that there is a certain limit to what we can do in medicine. And a big part of our work is to provide comfort. And that's where my training in palliative care, the limited training that I've had with communication, it's helped me open up conversations with my patients and their families. And it's led me to experiences at the end of life with my patients, and even within my family, the near and dear ones. I think when it becomes so close and personal.
Do you find patients are open to having that conversation?
For patients with chronic illness, it's almost as if they're waiting for someone to be honest with them. We have this feeling that, especially, and I'm going to say this, that in our country, we tend to think of older women as fragile and unable to deal with difficult news. And I find them disenfranchised in healthcare. And the fact is that there's studies to show that patients want to know so that they can plan their lives better. When I start conversations with my patients, they'll say, can we have a discussion? I'll bring my daughter and son-in-law next time and we can all sit down and talk about it. You know, it's a weight off their chest.
Hmm. It's actually very, very good. Yes.
And that's something that Dr. Roop has been, you know, a strong advocate for, open conversations with families.
In fact, if we go over to Dr. Roop, you are among India's leading advocates for advanced care planning and end of life care related issues. What led you down this path? What has your experience been, since you started, looking down this particular path?
Okay, so I'm a neurologist, and of course, there's a intellectual reason to why neurology, together with intensive care and palliative care, are the three specialties that have the most skin in the game. So it stands to reason that we needed to form a coalition to handle these issues. But it actually began kind of fortuitously. I mean, I'm a neurologist. I was called in by Justice Kardju to be on the medical panel that examined Aruna Shanbag. And we did that, we reported back, but that image stayed in my mind. And that idea that you could be completely, literally a plaything of everybody around you for 35, 40 years, it's something that hit me. And so the realization came that when it is my own time to go, I want the process under my control as much as possible. And I do not want the laws of my country to stop me from taking charge. And somehow, maybe it was the time, I mean, over these past few years, these things have begun moving. So the coalition that I spoke about, we call that ELICIT, End of Life Care in India Task Force. It's basically doctors, but there are legal people with us. I mean, and we've been able to draft a law, draft legislations, which we hope government can take up. We're a little sanguine about it, but well, hope is eternal. Now, the reason why I tell you that this is the time for it is sometime in 2017 and 18, the preamble to the Constitution, liberty, equality, fraternity, justice. Well, that liberty in 1947 to 50 was basically religious liberty and political liberty. And in 2017-18, the Supreme Court brought it into the personal space. The privacy judgment, Section 377, and medical autonomy. These three judgments literally came out by overlapping benches within that period of time. And the autonomy judgment recognized the constitutional validity of our own control. Unfortunately, unlike the other two judgments, in this medical autonomy judgment, the Supreme Court then went on to lay down procedures. You can do it this way, you can't do it that way, and you can do it this way. And unfortunately, the constitutional principle has been lost in that complicated process that they set up. So the constitutional validity of autonomy is a real thing. And I'd like to tell all your listeners, we put up the living will, a basic living will form that we have our group kind of made for India at this stage, because we are not as evolved as, for instance, in the United States, this whole thing has been going on for almost 50 years now. Different states have had different things. So over a period of time, it's really evolved a lot. And here we are right at the starting step. And I'd like to tell everybody that this living will is available. Please fill it up. There is a conversation around it, which is as important as the document. In fact, the conversation is far more important than the document. And I hope we can come to that point back again. But I'm putting this out to everybody there. What Rajni said is important. This is an important issue that we all need to take charge.
Yes, in fact, for those people who are on the chat window, a copy of that Living Will link has been put into that chat window, and you can take a look at it. But you know what you said about the preamble, Dr. Rup, was so striking. The other word that I believe that's in our preamble of our constitution, that as a country we tend to ignore lock, stock, and barrel on a regular basis, is the word dignity. It says that, you know, assuring the dignity of an individual, and the constitution repeatedly uses the word dignity. Do you believe that, you know, and I'm pulling, you know, based on what the other panelists have said so far, that because our healthcare is so focused on diagnosis and curing and, maybe even stretching out life instead of providing dignity, is there a piece that we're missing here? Because we don't want to acknowledge that we are at that point with family members.
So some of this goes back to, say, about 60 or 70 years ago. This happened all over the world, that medical care got better and better, treatment got better and better. And as it got better and better, death became medicalized. You no longer died at home, you died in ICUs. And sooner or later, people realized that that was not the way they wanted it. And the whole movement evolved to take back control at the end of life, except in India, because we don't talk about death. So because we don't talk about death, how do you tell somebody that, well, these are the last days, please prepare? You know, when you look at somebody who's near the end of life, I mean, you take it back to INSEAD, that kind of closure is basically comes from, you know, the extended family gathering around and so saying, forgiving, making that emotional closure happen. So we have to begin talking about death. When we begin talking about death, that is when we will get back control. And once we have control, you will not die ground down between the immovable force of natural biology. So the immovable rock of natural biology and the irresistible force of medical technology, which is what happens to all of us. We just get ground down at the end of life.
Right, and I'll come back to that. We have Smriti Rana also join us right now. Another message I want to read out from another anesthetist, and now I'm starting to worry. Punita Arthi, who said she's a doctor, she's afraid that she would be considered weak and too effeminate or too feminine by her colleagues if she's emotionally overwhelmed due to patient care and sensitive discussions or decision making. That's an interesting point of view. Smriti, you've spent the last 4 months actually talking to doctors and nurses, and I know you have a formal word for it, but running a sharing circle where they can actually talk about what they're going through, because we never ask our doctors and nurses what they're going through. We just expect them to be efficient robots that are constantly available to perform at the same level of efficiency. What has your experience been?
Thanks, Faye, and thanks everybody else. The experience has been so varied and so vast, with a lot of common threads running through them. And so why we started that circle was because we were getting all the stats and data, but we weren't getting the stories. And everybody's story is different, everybody's grief is different. And what came out was this tidal wave of emotion from within the healthcare system, which was not being addressed because, like Rajni said, it's not taught. You're not taught how to manage your own grief. You're expected to be stoic. The lady who shared that she'll be considered weak or too feminine if she shows her emotion. These are all such toxic stereotypes that we internalize that just negate our ability to process difficult emotion, and that emotion doesn't go away if you don't process it. It comes out somewhere else. And so, I just want to say that we're experiencing grief in ways that we've never done before, like Insia said. And we need to remember that grief is not only experienced when we lose a person, but also when we lose other things that matter to us. And, so the grief of separation is all over the place. We're unable to be with our loved ones. We don't know if we'll meet some of them again. Was that our last encounter with them? I wish I could have said something or done something or hugged them longer. And Faye, yesterday you had posted that 5 million people salaried, 5 million salaried people lost their jobs in India in just July, and that a total of 18.9 million salaried jobs have been lost since the lockdown began. That is a loss. And you know, all of people have lost their sense of stability, their sense of certainty about the future. All of these warrant grief and not just anxiety. So what else have we lost? We've lost human contact, the ability to hug people freely without caution, to a large extent our freedom. We can't go out, we can't go where we want to be, right? So grief takes many different forms, it speaks many languages. And you know, grief, remorse, there's a word saudade, they all are from the same family. And then there are the deaths, like people have already talked about, that are happening in isolation, and we're not being afforded our usual rituals of mourning to help us through that time. So, and all these losses, whether they're experienced within the healthcare system or in isolation or wherever else, they have a domino effect. They don't just stop with the grief, they cause other adverse effects like trauma, like clinical depression, sleep disruptions. How many people do we know who are complaining of not sleeping well? You just around, majority of the people in your circles are going to say that they've been sleeping badly. Okay, and substance abuse is a huge other fallout. And you know, Johan Hari, he said the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. We're losing connection at the moment. We might be meeting up on Zoom, but that basic human connection of being able to touch and hug and hold, we're losing that. So there is a massive upsurge in substance abuse issues. So what I'm trying to say is that, you know, sustained exposure to these abnormal triggers that cause stress, these over time cause trauma. So what the healthcare system is now experiencing is massive trauma. And those are the stories that are coming out in the safe space circles that we're running. And we are in for a pandemic of trauma. And I mean, just like some of the doctors have shared such poignant stories. Recently, I heard a doctor say that he had witnessed 24 deaths in just over a week. And that when one of the patients he was treating died of COVID, 3 of that patient's family members committed suicide, following which 2 nurses on the team quit. I mean, just look at that. Just look at that thread. That's unraveling. And so this is a time of not just grief as we have understood all this while, it's also a time of existential crisis. It is that. And there is a huge spiritual component to what we're going through. And I don't mean that purely from a religious sense. We're losing our sense of meaning, our sense of purpose. How many doctors have I heard say, I don't know why I'm doing this. It's not amounting to anything. Why, I don't even know who I am anymore, who I should be. I've heard someone say, I'm going to take a 2-week break. I don't know if I'm going to come back to it. And, you know, so that's the sort of domino effect. And very quickly, if I were to paint a few portraits of grief for you, some of the things that I would like to touch upon is anticipatory grief, where you know that there is an impending loss. You find yourself bracing impact. And imagine holding that kind of tension in your body and mind over a long period. It impacts your physical and mental health. And anticipatory grief can feel like a very long goodbye. You know, and there's something called disenfranchised grief that is not given legitimacy by society for a variety of reasons. It could be because the relationship is a non-traditional one. Healthcare workers are subjected to disenfranchised grief because as a doctor, you are not allowed to grieve for the patient that you cared for. And there's no space for it. And of course, there's something called complicated grief that many people have heard about. And it's the kind of grief that does not diminish, and it overpowers the grieving person's ability to function. And prior to the pandemic, complicated grief would usually happen because of, you know, the nature of the relationship with the person, the fact that there was distressing or disturbing circumstances around the death, or distressing or disturbing circumstances that took place after the death. But that has become the norm now. What used to be an exception is now the norm. So we're in for a storm of complicated grief. And do we have the systems to meet that? Like mental health, you know, support systems in our country especially were not very organized, you know, together in that sense. So where do we now look to? We look to the community. And it's up to us now to have these conversations because, you know, we don't have anywhere much to turn to. And I just, you know, there's something that I read recently which really struck me. a friend of mine told me this. She said one of the hardest kinds of grief to contend with is the grief over the disappeared. That is what is happening today. People are disappearing from our lives. So just to conclude, I've seen a lot of comments in the chat box talking about how do we have the conversation, it's difficult, etc. It should start within the family. Yes, it should start within the family. It's not, and that's one of the toughest places to have it actually. Yeah. But when the question is, does grief exist in a vacuum? No. The presence of grief indicates that there was something that we value there, which we lost. And can we have a conversation about death without talking about life and what makes it meaningful? No. So, you know, if we have these conversations while we are relatively healthy, we realize that these conversations about death and grief at their core are really conversations about life and meaning. And someone asked in the chat box, when can we have this? I'm going to quote there. It's always too early until it's too late. So have the conversation now, because don't wait for the crisis to hit. Now is when we have the conversation. So yeah.
Yes, that's actually very beautifully said. And this is the awkward thing, right? Whenever someone in a family says, hey, you know what, I want to talk about medical decisions that will be taken just in case, there's always a turnaround that says, no, why do you want to talk about these things right now? No. Yeah. There's the superstition that you're bringing things on. I remember trying to have a conversation with someone about the fact that I'm an organ donor. And I said, if there is an opportunity, I want you to give everything, whatever is possible to give. And it's like, what a morbid conversation to have. But there has to be some point where we actually have this conversation, because it has to happen when you're healthy. It cannot possibly, the definition of the decision is that you're not in a position to make it at later time. And I've seen Dr. Roop actually responding to some of the messages. And as we would have expected, there are, there's confusion and questions about the difference between euthanasia and withdrawal of care, and whether there's a possibility of misuse. And I want everybody to come in at this point, because, INSEE has been quiet, listening very carefully to this entire thing. And the truth is that when we find out that there is a family member who's just been diagnosed with what can be a very serious illness, your mind goes there, but you want to draw it back, because you think that if I start thinking these thoughts, and people try to think positive thoughts, you think that if I start thinking these thoughts, then we're going to push ourselves in that direction. Or if the person in question starts, talking about what they want or what their wishes are, that we will push ourselves in that direction. INSEE, is that what your family went through as well?
So Faye, that's a very interesting point that you made, and it takes me back to the time when we did get to know that my aunt was terminally ill, and she wasn't going to have too much time left, and we had to brace ourselves for it. And so that's when I feel whatever you go through when a loved one is diagnosed with a terminally ill disease, there are two facets that come into play. One is the medical side of it, and then one is the religious and the spiritual side of it. So the minute you are told that she's not going to, make it, or she doesn't have long to live, then the religion comes in the picture. And it's like, you have to pray, and, you have to make sure that you are offering this and offering that, and, appeasing the gods. And so everybody is, playing on a very, very different note over there. So yeah, the family was, my maternal cousins were taken into confidence, and they were spoken to by the doctors. And this was on a phone call. And they were told the reality of it. So it's not like anything was hidden from my aunt as well. In fact, that's the difficult part, because I think she knew more than any of us. Because when she went into the ICU for a chemo and nobody was there with her, and all those days that she was there alone, and even after she went, so it was twice that she went into the hospital, all of those times it was just her and the doctor. So I think she actually knew more than what we knew, in every sense of the way, and only she had the ability to deal with it, because I think there's also the sense of protection that comes into the picture, right? You don't want your children to know how much you're suffering or how much grief you are going through, because you're the one who's facing death. And I think that for me personally was a very difficult, because I was looking at it from a distance. She was, even though she is like my mother, or was like my mother, but I'm still not a doctor, so I was able to look at it in a very different way. And I knew that she is possibly protecting her children. And she kept telling them, don't worry, I'm coming home, So unknowingly what happens in such a situation is that there is hope. We start looking for hope, even though there is none. And as Dr. Roop said, the living will, everybody should talk about it, should do it, because at some given point of time, you are going to be talking about death in a very real sense, and it is real. What I personally feel is that we talk about, the person who's dying, and we talk about the person who's dead, but we don't talk enough about the people who have been left behind, and that also needs to happen.
Very, very well said, Doctor. I think I'm just reading out some more conversations. A lot of anesthetists on this conversation. Manisha Jaiswal says, I've done my course in palliative care under Dr. Rajgopal. We're all fans of Dr. Rajgopal. She says, I wanted to have a conversation with my father about death, but my mother became uncomfortable and stopped me, saying it was a very unlucky thing to talk about. These social taboos are the other reason why we're not talking about death. Dr. Bhatt, picking up from what INSEAD just said, invariably the last conversations that happen for patients, especially in COVID, happen with the intensivist or the intensive care team, because family is not around, so you're talking to the doctor. Is there, and I know that there's a sense of closure that the family seeks, asking the doctor what were the last words, what was she going through, was she going through pain, was there a struggle, did she go peacefully? Do you believe, and doctors and nurses are very busy people, but do you believe that this is a large part of helping family gain closure, is to be able to have these conversations with them and say, this is what she said, she was comfortable, this is what had happened, because it helps families sort of, go through that process.
Absolutely. Faye, I can tell you not just from the experience as a doctor, but I can tell you from the experience as a family member. Unfortunately, I lost a dearly beloved aunt to COVID. She had chronic illness, but she also acquired COVID about a little over a month ago. And a lot of what INSEAD said resonated so deeply with me, and I think for all of us, we were in a similar situation as a family. I was in quarantine at that point, so I wasn't at my aunt's bedside when I had promised her taking care of her for 5 years. And she had told me that when my time comes, I would like you to be with me. And I said, yes, I will. So there's this sense of helplessness of not having fulfilled a promise to someone you love. I knew she was getting excellent care with my colleagues. We as a family were disjointed in different parts of the world, but we had been getting updates from the doctors in the ICU every 2 hours. And the last update, literally half an hour before she passed, was that her breathlessness has reduced. She's resting comfortably. She had a little bit of coffee, which she really enjoyed. If that's the only thing I could tell my cousins, my mother, my sister, my aunts and uncles, this is the one piece of information that we have to hold on to.
Yes.
And it was so invaluable to us. And I'm sorry, we've still not, as a family, we haven't had a chance to grieve together yet. So INSEAD, I really do feel, and my heart goes out to you that you really, I had to stop family members from hugging each other. We had a whole bunch of people fall sick with COVID immediately after who were taking care of her. It's complicated. And the other part that I would like to address here is about collusion. And, INSEAD mentioned about your aunt, you said your aunt knew more than the children did. And I see this so often in my practice. Someone brought up the issue about collusion and doctors and family members not deciding to withhold the truth from patients. But most of the time, the older patients, they've lived life. And this is what I tell my patients, like, that's your mom, that's your dad. They brought you up. They're way smarter than you. They probably know. And they're not acknowledging it because they don't want to hurt your feelings. And they want to strive for your sake, even at the cost of their own pain. And when we have a conversation like this on both sides, and I will usually tell them, if it's a straight out question, it's hard for me to lie, but I can try and bring the two sides to be able to have the conversation on the same table together. And that's when we start acknowledging and accepting and working towards celebrating the life of that person and making sure that we spend time doing things that will really add value and meaning together. But what you shared was, it resonated so deeply with personal experiences of my patients too. And there's a humanness to all there's this universal quality to all our experiences, but we can start towards more open conversations so that the healing is better.
Right. And picking up from what something that Smriti said, so in mid-June, I lost the closest friend I have in the whole world, and someone who, to my husband and me, had become someone we met on a daily basis, took advice from on a daily basis, had become more family than real family. And it was not a gradual thing. He was okay 1 hour, and he was in a motorcycle accident, and he was gone on the spot. And it was harsh because I remember feeling anger for weeks and weeks and weeks, thinking, why wasn't I given a chance? Why weren't we given a chance to take him to hospital, to call the best doctors, to do whatever we could do? We were given no opportunity at all to attempt to save this person. It was a rude shock. And and you start to ask all these questions of where is this person? How can someone who was perfectly okay an hour ago be gone? And how is this? And we wanted to talk to the friends who were with him at that time and what happened, but not actually having that conversation with someone who spoke to him last. What did he say? What was he like? Was he happy? Was he sad? But I can't decide. What is worse? Being somehow emotionally prepared for the fact that a loss is coming, or just having it come out of the blue and have it take the carpet out from under your feet. It just takes so much longer to come to terms with the fact that something like this has happened. But I want to quickly get through some of the questions that are coming in. Dr. Roop, I see you already answering these questions, but there are questions about misuse, about the difference between withdrawal of care and euthanasia, which is a word that's being used a lot. And there's another question of, is it possible in India for someone to decide to die at home and not go to the ICU? Will the family members be seen as breaking the law if they don't rush someone to hospital? Dr. Roop?
Yeah, so I'll take the last question first. So if you decide that you are not going to have any particular treatment, then it is perfectly valid. It's your constitutional right. And any doctor who imposes any treatment on you against your wishes, well, if you wake up and come back, you can actually sue them. So, no, but elsewhere in the world, these are probably the most common litigations around end of life, that people say, for instance, somebody who's dying peacefully, well, doctors jump on him, do what is called resuscitation, put him into the ICU, and 1 week later, after trauma and after a huge bill, he's finally gone, and the family sues and usually wins. We haven't seen this in India yet, but that's likely to happen. Now, all of this presupposes that these conversations are held, that everybody is on board, and that this kind of peaceful passing is something that the system can support. That's what palliative care is for. That's what palliative care is supposed to do. And palliative care is not just for the patient. It's for the family. It's for the whole ecosystem. Now, if you look at it, and this is a point that I had wanted to bring up earlier, we in India import the latest technology. If you look at any medical technology, we are just a couple of millimeters behind the leading edge. This is soft skills technology. This is something where we are 50 years behind the rest of the world. And the problem is, unfortunately, the reason is because there is no, because, well, the medical industrial complex doesn't find it very, very, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to put it as profitable, but it's just not been interested in it. And I think it's not been lack of interest because it actually saves money. It's been an intellectual lack of interest.
If I may just jump in with a couple of comments on that, follow up to what Roop has mentioned. I see a couple of questions here from physicians who've spoken about their difficulty having conversations about living will, advanced care planning with their parents who are doctors as well. And I think one of the big things that we need to address is the lack of awareness within the medical community, including people in our specialties group of neurology, critical care, pulmonology, about the advances in legal protections that are now afforded. Things like hospital administrators not being aware of the FICCI guidelines for limitation of life-sustaining treatment, not being aware of the new ICMR guidelines about CPR, and the fact that the conversation is moving. Now, if we had more doctors aware of it, and secondly, if we had more of us trained in these conversations, the doctor who mentioned, I'm finding it difficult to have this conversation, I commend you for your honesty in sharing that. And I can tell you, I've had the conversation with my parents, and it gives me so much peace to know what their wishes are. It's not easy. Very recently, I had a conversation with my mother-in-law. It was over a cup of chai, 1.5 hours. We were discussing what Insia mentioned. It was Sushant Singh Rajput's demise, which triggered a conversation because my mother-in-law started thinking about things in the setting of his passing, COVID. How would I want things to be? How do I want to be remembered? What is it that I want? We have to look for opportunities for these conversations with our parents, and that's how they evolve organically. For medical professionals, if we are aware of all that we can offer in comfort care and know that we are not violating any medical ethics by doing so, we will actually get a greater sense of satisfaction in our work. The moral distress that we face in having patients prolonged on treatments that are not beneficial will be reduced. Overall, all of us need these conversations. Communication in my mind is like a procedure. You find it difficult to do this conversation because we weren't trained in it, but we were trained to do procedures like chest tubes and lumbar punctures, and we can do them in 5 minutes in an emergency. The more we practice these conversations, and that's what, the kind of courses that Pallium offers us is courses in communication and palliative care. That's what a large focus of our training is. And we get better and better. Just to be fully present with someone's distress and grief, it doesn't take long. It just needs you to acknowledge your humanness and their emotion and your reaction to it.
Right. Smriti, do you want to come in here on, the humanness of healthcare professionals? And we've had, I can't even read all of them right now. So many doctors actually writing in on what they go through on a daily basis.
Yeah. I think it's been very well expressed by both Rajni and Roop, and where do we draw the line? How do we compartmentalize? What do we bring to the table? As a psychologist, I was taught not to, we keep a box of tissues in the room, but there's certain safe spaces to touch somebody and this and that. It's all very prescribed. And I remember the first time when I was a young intern in a hospice, there was this elderly gentleman, didn't speak a word of English. I didn't speak a word of Kannada. And I would go in every day and, I would sort of gesture to him that, okay, come on, why don't you come and brush your teeth now? And let's go for a walk outside. And I think by day 4 or 5, he would just see me coming down the ward and he'd be like, oh God, and get up, because he didn't want to have that. He didn't want me to do that. And I remember walking into the ward one day and I saw him sitting on the bed and weeping. And maybe that's the day he came to terms with the fact that he was dying. I don't know. He was alone. His family had abandoned him. I don't know what relationship he had with his family that they would not be with him in his dying days. And I was all of 21. Society dictates that I have certain, terms of engagement in dealing with an elderly man from a different community, etc. I may have broken some boundaries there, but I gave him a hug. And because I didn't have the language. And the next day when I came there, I saw him sitting outside next to a water body. And he asked me if I wanted a cup of tea. And I said, sure. And then I thought he wanted one. So I went to get it for him, but he had actually, it was him offering it to me. And after that, I saw him go from bed to bed and offer solace and comfort to other people. That day, something changed. And it was so palliative care has also been a lot of unlearning for me. Unlearning of all these other rules that we prescribe that are meant to safeguard the doctor, the healthcare worker and patient relationship. But I find that some of it does not really serve the purpose anymore. And I'm not saying go out and hug all your patients all the time and be inappropriate about it. But I am saying that we have to educate ourselves, like Rajni said, in certain communication skills, in the way we engage with people, and use our discretion to know when a human touch exceeds or is needed rather than a prescription or something else.
This is one of the things I personally believe we've lost in the lockdown, right? Our ability to just sit together without agenda. Right now, all conversations that we have with people outside of our homes are either work conversations or appointments. We set it on Zoom and then we talk to each other like this. But the ability to just sit with someone with no agenda and just share that closeness, the physical intimacy of sharing a cup of tea, eating together, drinking together, whatever it was, we've lost that aspect. And so, and as a journalist, I believe that there's a great deal of processing of information that happens when you're casually talking to someone, whether it is about the death of a celebrity or something that has happened to your own life or something that you read about. All of the emotions that you're feeling, you get to process when you're talking to someone casually over coffee or over tea, and you just let it all out. We've lost that entire aspect of human communication completely because we're only calling each other professionally now. We're not. Yeah, Smriti.
Yeah, Faye, that is so important. Why are we having this conversation? And, it's happening easily. And if I just look at how many people signed up for this webinar, we put the word a couple of days ago. People are here because they want to talk about it, right?
Yes.
It is there. And we've somehow over the years constructed this whole thing of we can't go there unless we have a specific set of skills or somebody's guiding us through the conversation. You will actually be surprised at how much of there is a need to talk about it. And once you open that door, it becomes a relatively, it's a conversation that does start to flow. And I just want to take a minute to address something that came up, which I think is a very relevant point. Where do children fit in all of this?
Yes.
That's a whole other webinar, I'm afraid. But children have, we know, we have wonderful colleagues who work very closely with children in palliative care. We dismiss children as not experiencing grief the way adults do, which is absolutely not true. And it's up to us as adults to learn those skills. It's not rocket science, it's meeting the child where they are. But oftentimes, whether it's in collusion that, some people have brought up, or whether it's with children, we project our fears onto the others. And then we say, we don't want to go there because they don't want to go there. But it's not that. It's we don't want to go there because we're scared. So it's really up to each one of us to, like Rajni talks about death literacy. We need to take away the doom and gloom around death, because talking about death just brings life into sharper focus. And I think that's absolutely a conversation, right? We're really discussing life.
So the other thing I want to acknowledge right now, if I may, a lot of questions about why palliative care as a subspecialty, super specialty isn't part of the MBBS or nursing training. Is there an aspect of bedside manner, or is there an aspect of palliative care or end-of-life care that is taught, or should it be taught? Harsh, do you want to come in on that?
I'll take the second question first, Faye, because it's easier. Should it be taught? Yes. So is it taught? It's a great omission, not just from our family and hospital conversations. It's actually an omission from our medical curriculum. If I am Rajni, Dr. Roop, please correct me. I think the Medical Council of India only introduced some aspects of palliative care, which had to do with your communication skills, some end-of-life care, and some pain relief as late as 2019. And here we are in a situation where this new batch has to just touch upon soft aspects of this very big thing that we are discussing. And they'll be taught by teachers who have never been trained in it. So just teaching about what we are getting into takes a whole other skill set, which is completely missing from our medical imagination. So yeah, it should be taught. Soft aspects have been introduced, and just as much as the curriculum needs to be strengthened, the people delivering the curriculum need to be strengthened, because they come from, how Rajni calls it, another generation.
I must note here, and this is an important thing, that since we started this conversation, the panelists have either smiled or given each other reasons to smile about 12 or 13 times in a conversation about death and grief. So it doesn't have to all be gloom and doom. I have one question I want to place before the panel. Just raise your hand if you want to come in on this. When family members talk about death to each other, to children, there is this whole, the problem with it is none of us know, right? It's sort of tied in with religion. What happens to me after I die? Where has daddy gone? Will I ever see him again? Is there a meaning to any of this? Why him? at this point, or why her at this point? Why couldn't we have been given an extra half an hour? Why couldn't it have waited until I managed to make that phone call? The truth is, none of us humanly know what happens after death. At least, we know what happens physically and scientifically, but we don't know to answer any of these questions. So any help right now on, is that the reason why we shy away from answering these questions, because it's scary and it's unknown? And are there any good ways to answer these questions? Anyone who wants to take this?
Okay, so I'm going to be a little mechanistic about this and basically look at the process of actually having this conversation. And if anybody is interested, I've already put that. One is the conversation project. That's very, very nice. It's a nice site to look at. And the other is something that one of my our friends, common friends, runs. It's called Death Over Dinner. You might have heard about it. So basically, you kind of demystify it. And please remember that if death was such a, I mean, if you talked about death and you died, well, then Tibetan Buddhism should have died out a long time ago, because that's part of their meditation practice every day. You're supposed to think about your death for about 5 minutes every day. And if they can do it, everybody can do it, and we can talk about it. And if we talk about it, we demystify it. And then after that, I mean, if you have religious or other points that you want to take up and elaborate, I suppose that's everybody's individual flavor. Mine is, from dust I come and to dust I shall return, and that's the end of it. One random bit of protoplasm on a random planet in a random universe, and that's the end of it.
I'd like to just share a few observations here. Roop, I'm very grateful for this protoplasm that is on this planet as an advocate for legislative reform in this field. And, I just wanted to address something here about conversations about death, right? About what do you say at that time? Again, this is a place where I can express my vulnerability as a doctor. And, when the patient asks you what, they're not really expecting an answer. They're expecting you to spend time and listen. You're supposed to hold space for them to vent what their anxieties and fears are. And we as doctors are fixers. So we like to jump in with answers. And when we don't have answers, then we go through our own discussion. We don't have the answers to these questions. But at that point, what we have to do is to just be with them, to be by their side in their confusion, in their distress. And, this is as uncomfortable as it is in the beginning. These silences are actually very healing. Listening, receiving, it's humbling. And that's the thing. Now, another thing about children that I'd like to share, Mr. Rogers was this legendary television anchor psychologist who had a program running for years and years. And he could talk to children about death, divorce, destruction, discrimination, just any bad D word that you can come up with. And he used to say this, that anything that is human, that is part of the human experience, is mentionable. And if it is mentionable, it is manageable. And that's the thing. When it comes to religious beliefs and things, I try and keep it according to the patient and the family's belief systems. And I try to learn about that so that I can help them find the reference points that will help support them through that process. My own personal belief systems, I try and keep away from that. But it's really about supporting them in that process, and we can't have all the answers. And the sooner we accept that, then we start that partnership of we'll walk together, but we won't let go of your hand.
And Rajni, there's, I think, an important point to make is when we talk about, and this I've seen in my practice over several years, is when we say people are afraid to my mother because she can't.
We lost your audio.
Yeah, would you say that again? We lost your audio for a second.
Couple of sentences.
So I was saying that when people say, don't talk to my mother about her impending death or the bad prognosis or whatever else, she's afraid of dying. A lot of the times when we actually go into that space, and I'm not saying we rush into it, it's obvious, we go into it in bite-sized chunks. It depends on how much they're ready to receive. very often it's not the fear of death, it's how the death will happen.
Yes.
And that's, and we have the ability. So, you know, it's like, will I suffocate? Will I be in a lot of pain? Like, what's going to happen? Am I going to lose my mind? Am I going to make and Faye, you talked about dignity. And I'm so glad you brought it up, because dignity means different things to different people. And one man's dignity is very different from another woman's, is very different from a child's. But when we sit with them and we understand what it is that they're afraid of losing, which is making them anxious. And if we as the healthcare community have the wherewithal to walk with them and say, you know what, we have ways to make sure that you will not be breathless. We will make sure that you're not in unbearable pain. You will not be alone when you die. That goes a very long way in facilitating this conversation, because again, I can't say this enough, it's a conversation about what the quality of life will be, rather than, you know, so when someone says they're afraid of death, I would say reframe the question to say, what exactly are you afraid of? And this is the kind of thing that usually comes out. And we have the ability to have that conversation.
Oh, if I can I ask Smriti
Please.
to share that story about Dr. Rajgopal and the fisherman?
Yes.
Do we have the time?
It takes 2 minutes.
Yes, yes, go ahead. One last story.
Okay.
This will really make it special.
So basically it came from this point where I've mentioned this in other forums. I didn't know, I mean, I knew what total pain was theoretically, and total pain is defined as pain that is felt physically, but is influenced by the circumstances of a person's life. So if I were to ask you, you know, you have a headache on a Monday morning, on a pain scale, it's 4. You can take the day off. You have a benevolent boss who let you be at home. It's fine, it'll stay a 4. But if you have to go out and brave all kinds of traumas in the world, you have a flat tire, that same 4 on 10 is going to be an 8 on 10. So that was how I understood it. And then I was with Dr. Raj in my early days in Pallium. And through our home care program, we were called in to see a patient for the first time. We'd never met him before. The community told us that he needed to be seen. We could hear him, you know, screaming in agony from like hundreds of meters away. And his house was, there was this terrible stench. This poor wife of his was helpless, distraught. She didn't know what to do. He had been discharged from the hospital with a feeding tube. And, you know, in India, we think looking after somebody is feeding them also. But his body couldn't take it. And he basically, so she was feeding him. He had a bowel obstruction. He couldn't pass, you know, he couldn't pass his waste. So he was also regurgitating it. It was such a terrible mess. And his pain was 9 on 10, 9 on 10. The team attended to him, brought his pain down to 6, but it just wouldn't budge from there. And I think after a while, you know, the team cleared out and we were there. Dr. Raj asked him, what is bothering you? What is bothering you right now? And I thought, God, you know, it's kind of obvious what's bothering him, but that's what we do, we assume. And after a very long silence, 6 minutes, which is very long, he said, all I wanted was for my children not to be fishermen. And that's what they're going to be. He knew he was dying. He knew his wife couldn't look after them. And all he was worried about was those 2 children becoming fishermen like him. And so we run a program where we take over we sort of support educational needs of children from disease-ravaged families that have been financially destroyed. And so we sped up that whole process. And within 24 hours, we had people who had pledged these 2 children through to college. So we went back to the house. He was still at 6 on 10, still in agony. So finally we sat down with him and he was shown the documents and said, your children are not going to be fishermen. And then he was asked, you know, what is your pain now? And he said 1. And that was my biggest lesson in total pain, that you miss the forest for the trees, you know, because you want to, it's not just about what the person is physically reporting. It's about everything that's going on in their lives. So, and sometimes these kind of landscape questions are a good way to approach the conversation around death and dying. So, yeah.
Okay.
But unfortunately, we have in fact run out of time. We've done more than run out of time. We've overshot a great deal. In the chat windows, there's palliumindia.org. You can take a look at Pallium India for the work that's being done. If you want to get involved, if you need help, if you want to get involved with someone in your city who might be able to help you through something, or if you want to be some of the people who help through something, it's important to just read through and understand what is going on, just to sensitize ourselves a little better. I want to thank our panelists for being so open with your stories, for sharing so much. It has been, I think for me, one of the hardest, conversations I've had to go through also, because this is not about the news, right? This is about something far more personal, far more real. The truth is, there's that story that we read in Kannada as children in school, where there's a woman who went crying to Buddha, saying that my son is dead. Please bring him back. And he said, go get me a fistful of mustard from a house that has seen no death. And when you get that fistful of mustard, I will bring your son back. And she went from house to house in her village. And in every house, there had been some death or the other. And there was no house that death had not visited. And then she went back to him, and she realized that by that time she went back to him, she realized her grief was not unique. And it wasn't even the worst. There were people who had faced far worse than her. And I think that sort of reminds us that death is real. It lives around the corner, and you never know when it's going to come to say hello. But it's about being prepared. It's about being mentally prepared for the pain, physically prepared for the pain, but having those conversations and being there for each other. So I thank our panel so much for having this conversation with me today. And I do know that Pallium India is going to continue to do all of this wonderful work. So if there are ways in which we can get involved, we should all find a way to do so. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just a little shout out, on the 24th of August, which is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's death anniversary, we're hosting a virtual memorial to celebrate the lives of people we loved and lost. And it's not just this year, whenever, and we're sharing some stories. It's just a gathering where we can come in as a community from anywhere, come in and just share that space. So all are welcome, and we will be sharing details of that soon. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Smriti.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.